collaboration with仏教伝道協会to be given by an eminent distinguished scholar who was awarded Toshi Prize in Buddhism in the previous academic year. It is our great pleasure to be given an opportunity to learn from the state of the art products from the producer himself or herself. My name is Masahiro Shimoda, teaching at the Department of Indian Philosophy and Buddhist Studies, Graduate School of Humanities and Sociology. One of the winners of Toshi Prize in 2014 is Professor Erik Braun at University of Oklahoma, present here in person. Professor Braun is at the leading edge of the field of Pali Buddhism and modern Buddhism in Theravāda countries, especially in Burma. He gained a PhD in 2008 from the Committee of the Study of Religion at Harvard University with the dissertation title Ledi's Theravāda, Abhidhamma, and the Development of the Modern Insight and Meditation Movement in Burma. Based on numerous papers of solid content in this field conducted over a decade, he published The Birth of Insight, Meditation in Modern Buddhism, and the Burmese monk Ledi's in Chicago Press, in the University of Chicago Press in 2013, and this is the object of the Toshi Prize. So I'd like to, as a brief introduction to his very eminent book, I'd like to quote meticulous comments on his work given by Professor Robert Sharf, the chair in the committee of Toshi Prize. I quote, Erik Braun's superbly researched, elegantly crafted, an eminently accessible book is the most authoritative study to date of Ledi's Yellow and the origin of modern Buddhist meditation revival in Burma. But its significance goes well beyond the confines of 20th century Burmese history. Ledi's Yellow and his followers laid the foundation for Buddhist modernism, and by the last quarter of the 20th century, their innovative, yet sometimes controversial approach to Buddhist doctrine and practice had spread the rest of Asia, as well as to Europe, America, and beyond. Braun's account of their achievements should be required reading for anyone interested in the roots of modern insight or mindfulness meditation practice. Unquote. In fact, for me, it was intellectually thrilling experience in reading this book to be gradually aware of a completely unexpected thing, that the modernization of Burmese Buddhism and the resultant influence on the present world were framed by two apparently irrelevant factors. One, the popularization of crucial Buddhist philosophical texts, and the other, the standardization or simplification of meditative practice by a modern Buddhist monk, Ledi. Professor Braun is now preparing for other works, namely Great Awakening, Buddhist Meditation, and Secular Enchantment of American Life, and Buddhist Studies, and the scientific study of meditation, and the like. So I'll stop here, and I'd like to call on Professor Braun to have a very speech with a title of the Many Lives of Insight, the Abhidhamma, and the Transformations into Theravāda Meditative Practice, past to present.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you, Professor Shimoda, for those very kind words of introduction. Can everyone hear me all right? Okay. Let me say, too, before I begin the talk proper, just to extend some thanks generally. First to the BDK, to the chairman Toshihide Numata, to the executive director Tadashi Ikuta, and to all the folks there for making the prize possible and for making it possible for me to come here and give this talk. Also to the faculty here at the University of Tokyo. And I'd like to extend a special thanks to Reverend Nayuki Ogi for all that he has done, a tremendous amount of effort both before I came and then also while I'm here to make this trip so enjoyable and just really a pleasure. I've had a great time already. And I'm very glad to get to talk to you about my work. This talk comprises a sort of précis or a synopsis or sort of an overview, let's say, of some of the work that was involved in the book, The Birth of Insight. And then what I'll try to do is carry my research forward in my current project, so you can see the links between the two, and sort of talk about some of the issues I'm concerned with now that have continuities with what came before. So this talk, which is sort of originated out of receiving the Toshi Prize, we'll talk about that book that received the prize, but then kind of carry my book forward. So I'm going to talk off my remarks, which I think, off my prepared remarks, which I think many of you have. I might extrapolate a little bit. I'll stick fairly close to them. To begin, insight meditation, it's often called mindfulness meditation. It has been and continues to be one of, as I say, if not the most powerful forces in the development of modern Buddhism, East or West, and it seems, in fact, to be growing stronger. It is without a doubt now a worldwide phenomenon. And there are, of course, other very important forms of meditation in the contemporary scene. One thinks of varieties of practice in Zen, also varieties of practice in Tibetan Buddhism as well, just to give you a couple of examples of areas of fervent activity. Not to mention the fact there's, of course, forms of meditation that are quite influential outside of Buddhism, such as TM. Now, partly my focus is on insight meditation because originating in Southeast Asia, and more specifically originating in the early 20th century in Burma, now often called Myanmar, insight practice is tremendously important as a force affecting the Theravāda Buddhism of the region, that is of Southeast and South and Southeast Asia, which of course is consisting of well over 100 million people. And quite simply, we can say that in those cultural contexts, insight meditation has transformed the very idea of what it means to be a Buddhist. And my talk today, I think, will give some indication of this. But there's more, because as I noted a moment ago, insight is now affecting people's lives across the world. Indeed, we could say in revolutionary ways. Perhaps some of you have seen this somewhat hyperbolic cover indicating the sense of the stakes involved, the kind of effects of insight and its spread. Now, in America, and of course this cover comes from an American magazine, there are other forms of meditative practice, Soto Zen, Tonglen from the Tibetan tradition, what have you, that do indeed get mixed into Western approaches to meditation, and even into the approaches of mindfulness movements. Nonetheless, insight meditation, as it is first formulated in Burma, is at the heart of this so-called revolution. And just a couple of statistics to underline its prominent position, at least in the U.S. In 2012 alone, there were 477 clinical studies of insight practice. Here's a chart that actually shows the ascent of scholarly interest, which really exploded in recent years. In 2007, for another statistic, Americans spent roughly $4 billion on treatment, and that number has only grown in intervening years to now. Now, the fact is that modern insight meditation, now being formulated and reformulated across the world, most definitely still in Burma, but now tangled up with teachers and organizations in America and elsewhere, is profoundly affecting many people's lives, leading to what, in the American scene, the scholar of American Buddhism, Thomas Tweed, calls the Buddhification of America, or particularly the Buddhification of American culture. Preeminently, insight meditation is doing this by reconfiguring the relationships between the secular and and the spiritual, especially in the US, but also in Burma. Such reconfiguration, without a doubt, can radically change people's lives. Questions about whether they have children, who they vote for, all sorts of things. Ultimately, their very notions of who they are, their very sense of self and subjectivity. And this reconfiguring scrambles any attempt to chart the sort of progression of modernization in Buddhist trajectories on a global stage. Hence the title, The Many Lives of Insight, originally moving east to west, but now going back and forth. Indeed, Reverend Ogi was telling me that the insight meditation has become quite popular in Japan, and that a major source of influence is actually Google and their mindfulness programs, which just goes to show the kind of back and forth and the kind of complex sources of dissemination in the globalized scene. Well, these sort of developments, these sort of issues are at the very heart of my current book project that was mentioned, entitled The Great Awakening. Now, to get at these kind of transformations in insight meditation and their ramifications, I'm focusing today on two seminal figures in insight meditation's formulation as a mass practice: the Burmese monks Ledi and the Burmese monk Ha'o. Now I'm going to look at these two men and how they used a particular critical resource to enable insight's ascendancy, its popularization. That resource is the Abhidhamma, which is to say the philosophical texts of Theravāda Buddhism and the analytical method those texts exemplify. The historical reality of insight meditation as a global phenomenon, shaping, reshaping many forms of Buddhism, modernist forms of Buddhism, well, that's been made possible by what Max Weber called concrete genetic sets of relations, created in this instance by Abhidhamma thinking. Now, this take on the Abhidhamma as this sort of productive source of social change might surprise folks who know something about it, as it's not usually seen as the active basis for profound social change. As profound as it may be, it's not usually seen as a kind of social lever. But as I think you'll see, it has been the foundation of the mindful revolution that's taking place all around. First, however, for those whose research and teaching interests may lie outside of the Abhidhamma, let me give here some basic information about it. This is a very very basic information here. The Abhidhamma refers first to you see here on the left, the collection of 7 canonical texts, but also to much commentarial literature that seeks to analyze reality in terms of what is understood to be ultimately real, paramatta, as it's laid out initially in those 7 canonical texts. The purpose of the Abhidhamma is to parse reality into its ultimate parts, called dhammas, of which there are 82 in the Theravāda system. You can see them on the right-hand side there. There's only one consciousness, there's 28 physical factors, 52 mental factors, and the one Dhamma of Nibbana, or awakening. Those 82 parts are really more properly understood as categories of events, because each of these Dhammas arises and passes away in an instant. Well, much faster than a finger snap, in fact, billions in a finger snap, and then they're gone. So to see those events, to see crystal clearly the first 81 Dhammas operating in immensely complex combinations, is to grasp the one unconditioned Dhamma, which is Nibbana or awakening. Now, I'm not even scratching the surface, of course, of the complexity of this system, but further particulars will be most useful if we move now into a discussion of its relevance within the Burmese context. So let's do that. Typically, the Abhidhamma has been perceived as something really of concern only to a handful of elite monastics, far beyond the concerns of your typical Theravāda Buddhist, let alone a secular American meditator. This impression is broadly true even in Theravāda cultures. In fact, the Professor Charlie Halsey at Harvard told me that in Sri Lanka, often, there's an expression among English speakers, if they don't understand something, they'll say, "Oh, that's all Greek to me." That means it's sort of incomprehensible. Apparently, in Sri Lanka, they'll often say, "Oh, it's all Abhidhamma to me." Completely ununderstandable. Now, among Western scholars, especially in the 19th and early 20th centuries, the Abhidhamma's taxonomic and scholastic complexity was viewed often as actually a distortion of the genuine teachings of the Buddha as they are found in the Sutta Pitaka. And this sort of impression led to their relative neglect, that is, the neglect of the study of the Abhidhamma. This is not the case, of course, in Burma, where the Burmese take great pride in a collective sense of themselves as distinctively dedicated to the Abhidhamma. This seems to have been the case since at least the 17th century. The Abhidhamma's popularity is evident even if you just walk down the street in Yangon, the former capital of Mandalay, still it's Myanmar's largest city. Take the 24 conditional relations, called the Patana, found in the last book of the canonical Abhidhamma. That teaching, the conditional relations, is understood to be the quintessence of the Abhidhamma, and where it said the Buddha finally found the full play of his omniscience. It's ubiquitously represented everywhere as rays of multicolored light behind the Buddha's head, because, of course, when you realize the Abhidhamma fully, there's that light emerged. Printed on monks' bands, you see that kind of golden effigy of a monk, and the conditional relations on the span, above monasteries, entrances, all over the place. Also hanging from the rearview mirrors of taxi cabs, very common. Yet even in Burma, the Abhidhamma, though widely celebrated in all these ways, was still almost entirely studied by monastics, and only an elite cadre, in fact, went beyond the basics until things changed in the 20th century. To understand the popularization of Abhidhamma study in Burma at this time, we turn now to our first figure, Ledi Seada, or as I will refer to him for simplicity's sake from now on, just Ledi. Ledi was the focus of my book, The Birth of Insight, and I'm drawing on that work for much of what follows about him. He was born in the village of Sangpien in royally controlled Upper Burma in 1846, some 60 miles from Mandalay. You can see it in the upper part of Burma there, and kind of in the middle. Near actually the town of Moyua, which you can see is marked on there as well. He entered a traditional world of monastic learning when he ordained at the age of 10. He would become distinguished as a brilliant scholar, especially adept in the study of the Abhidhamma. And it is he who would, as one Burmese scholar put it, spread the Abhidhamma like falling rain, and thereby make it a topic to be studied by all. And crucially, is he who would tie its study to mass meditation. Well, how did he do this? Well, not by himself, to be sure, but in response to popular interest, revealed to him in a fierce controversy he created with the publication in 1901 of a commentary he had written entitled the Paramahansa Dipani. That work seeks to explain another work, a 12th century Sri Lankan text, a polylanguage compendium of the entirety of the Abhidhamma system entitled the Abhidhamma Sangha. So popular is the Abhidhamma Sangha in Burma, and really all over the Theravāda world, that at least in Burmese, they simply call it the Thinjo, which means the compendium. And even now, if you say Thinjo in Myanmar, everybody knows the book you're talking about. We're looking just a moment at this controversy involving this work will give us a richer sense of the Abhidhamma as an intellectual and social reality as well in Burma, and it will explain how it became the basis for the start of mass insight practice. Now, the appearance of Ledi's commentary on the Abhidhamma Sangha calls what I call in The Birth of Insight the Great War of the Commentaries. And this controversy stemmed from the 245, often quite blunt, critiques of other commentaries Ledi made in the course of his own work. So Ledi would typically point out where he saw an error, and then he would say, in some other work, commenting upon the Abhidhamma Sangha, and then he would say, Tam na sundaram. Basically, that's not correct. His frequent and plain-spoken criticisms, they angered a great deal of people. There was at least one book burning, many public demonstrations, numerous denunciations in the press, and many responses published in other books. Actually, entirely other books published to refute Ledi's approach. This slide shows the various, or at least some of the various relationships in dispute. Green lines show the focus of comment, red the focus of critique. Above all, Ledi took to task another foundational commentary on the Abhidhamma Sangha, sort of older brother text to his own. That's entitled the Abhidhamma Vibhavini. Many people relied upon this work for their understanding of the Abhidhamma Sangha, and thus the Abhidhamma system as a whole. Indeed, the Vibhavini is typically called in Burmese the Tikajwa, which means simply the famous sub-commentary. So to attack that Tikajwa was to attack the authority of the people who based their very authority on their understanding of that text. And hence, to some degree, that explains the controversy. Now, I'm going to pass over, however, the specifics of the dispute, because as I discovered after digging out many Pali and Burmese responses to Ledi, often in obscure monasteries, monastery libraries in the Burmese countryside, well, to quote Gertrude Stein, there is no there. In other words, there's really nothing of substance in any of the critiques. They're fascinating. I give numerous examples in The Birth of Insight. But whatever the example, none of them were used as thin into the wedge to alter the Abhidhamma system. The reason you might suspect people would get upset over Ledi's work. Now this has certainly happened in the past. Think of the arising of the class of dharmas in the Vaibhashika Abhidhamma system that straddles the divide between the mental and the physical, the namaskanda and the rupaskanda. These are called the chitta viprayukta samskaras. Examples of these are birth, old age, the phrase, the symbol. These came to be considered real, dravya, only after debate that thereby changed in fundamental terms the nature of reality in the Vaibhashika worldview. And change was certainly possible in the Theravāda system as well. The idea of the three phases in time of a mind moment only emerges in commentarial literature, as does the fully fleshed out process of consciousness, chitta, and the notion of the smallest particles of physical reality called kalapas. This is all in the Theravāda system, that this emerges in commentarial, essentially commentarial exegesis and debate. But no such changes crept in through Ledi. This is not to say that they couldn't have crept in through Ledi. He just didn't take the opportunity to do such a thing. So then what would make something so seemingly philosophically inconsequential as a bunch of critiques that make no difference fundamentally to the Theravāda Abhidhamma system, what would make them a matter for book burning, public debates, letter to the editors and newspapers? I mean, monastics who felt their authority threatened might get upset, but why would an audience beyond the Abhidhamma elite, why would they care? And why would even elites care, actually, when at this time that Ledi publishes this book, in 1901, he wasn't very well known at all. He's just a kind of fairly young upstart at this moment. Why did they get so exercised? Well, in essence, a long-standing valuation of the Abhidhamma met the charged circumstances of the colonial moment. This is the actual picture of the British arriving in Mandalay when they took over the whole of Burma in 1880, very, very late 1885, early 1886. At that time, many were very, very anxious that Buddhism was going to disappear, and soon. Now, what goes first when Buddhism disappears? The Abhidhamma. And within that, specifically, the patana, the conditional relations. As one Burmese contemporary monk puts it, the Abhidhamma is, quote, the frontline fortress for Buddhism's survival. With the Kalas, the barbarian Christian British in control, that's not referred to, Ledi's work, perceived by many as a destabilizing attack on that very frontline fortress, was seen as an attack on Buddhism's very existence. This was especially so because a robust print culture had just appeared, thanks to colonialism that made Ledi's work widely accessible. So why would even elites care about a young upstart who writes this very critical book? Well, for the first time, a young upstart's views could be spread all over the place in a way they never had before, and this caused a tremendous impact compared to what had happened before. This anxiety, that this appearance of Ledi's work with this sudden, robust print culture gave rise to widespread interest in the nitty-gritty of these debates involving these critiques of Ledi's. Okay. But then how did this kind of argumentation over Abhidhamma translate into popular practice? What did Ledi do to make that happen? Well, what Ledi did was to drive continuing interest in the Abhidhamma by tying it to the preservation of the Dhamma, this very thing people were worried was going to disappear in a colonial moment, and explicitly by tying it to the promise of meditation as something plausible for busy lay people on the very basis of the study of the Abhidhamma. So the Abhidhamma protects Buddhism, and it's what can make meditation for one's own well-being and whatnot plausible on an everyday basis for busy people living in the world. Ledi spread the word in many books by preaching all over the country and by organizing lay people among themselves. He became, by the end of his life, by far the most famous monk in the country. And his efforts would lead to unprecedented study of the Abhidhamma among lay people. The linchpin of his efforts was his most popular work, perhaps Burma's first print bestseller, the Paramatta Tanke, or the Summary of the Ultimates, written in 1903. Here's a fairly recent cover of that work. It's still in print, very much. This was it's a 690-verse poem that sets as its aim to translate into Burmese the Abhidhammata Sangaha. A translation, furthermore, that, as Ledi put it, quote, can be mastered easily by women, men, students, and children if they strive for 3 to 4 months. This was highly appealing because it meant the most precious of Buddhist teachings, the first to disappear when Buddhism can now be preserved through memorization by regular people, regular folks. But the poem actually does more than simply translate. In subtle ways, it reorients the Abhidhamma system to lay life, and the accompanying auto-commentary, usually published with it, in fact, ties its study, the study of this poem, to the meditative pursuit of awakening. So this comes from the auto-commentary. As Ledi says in the auto-commentary, the poem made possible awakening in this very life, Ibawakmape. That term will become a hallmark of modern meditation, much used in insight meditation circles. This can be seen actually in this influential book by Sayadaw U Pandita, In This Very Life. With Ledi, so far as I know, is the expression's first appearance, this idea of in this very life, you get awakening. This idea of the possibility of awakening in one life, indeed the possibility of awakening at all, never mind among the laity, was absolutely revolutionary. Up to this time, almost no one meditated, and it was, including monks, and it was no rhetorical flourish on Ledi's part. In numerous other writings, these are all of his writings inscribed in stone in his monastery up near, in the town of Moniwa. He wrote a lot. In all of these writings, or at least very many of them, he provided details about the links between study and practice. This is kind of the exemplary quote. He would argue, as you see here in the bold, for the maturity of knowledge, and he would use specific concepts and terms drawn from the Abhidhamma, above all the idea of the fundamental particles of materiality, the kalapas, in order to explain how to meditate. So here's another quote which exemplifies that. His dependence on the Abhidhamma to formulate meditative practice is especially evident in one of his most well-known works on meditation, the Vipassana Dipani, or the Manual of Insight, which is organized around the list of the 82 Dhammas we talked about earlier, those 82 Dhammas of the Abhidhamma system. The power of all this study conferred specific benefits. First, it acted as a sort of force multiplier on meditation's potential. Hence, insight could arise in any mundane moment, seen in the right way through preparatory intellectual exercises, which is what is indicated here by what's in bold. More practically, it also offered the chance to skip lengthy conditioning of the mind through cultivation of deep concentrative states. So a brief word about the technicalities of meditation as a system will help us understand this crucial point about a kind of skipping or shortcut to liberative insight. It's a rather complicated looking slide here. Meditative cultivation, bhavana, encompasses fundamentally two processes: calming, samatha, and that of insight, vipassana. Calming is typically done first, and it develops concentration, samadhi. Such concentration grows until one reaches a threshold state called access concentration, vichara samadhi, and then one enters into these really deep levels of absorption called the jhanas. Classically, you must finish at least, the first 4 jhanas before turning to insight practice. And this is understood to be a very tough job, one you're typically seen as having to dedicate yourself to full-time for a long time, usually removed from society, in the jungle, in a cave. For the first time, justified on the basis of Abhidhamma learning around about 1904, Ledi presents another option as a sensible choice for a mass audience. Now, of course, this option I'm going to discuss is present in the Visuddhimagga, the 5th century, absolutely critical text of the Theravāda tradition. And it's actually, this notion that I'm going to talk about, this shortcut, is present in the canonical literature as well. But it had never been promoted before as a live option for a mass audience, particularly the lay people. Well, what's the shortcut? Ledi argues that a person can elect to do what's called sukha vipassana. You see it on there. It's a sort of arrow indicating you get to jump past all of that stuff. You use this dry insight practice using what is called momentary concentration, kanika samadhi, typically understood as a level of concentrative power of the mind prior to access concentration. In this dry insight scheme, you largely, if not entirely, forego all of these calm and concentrative levels to jump straight into insight practice. This setting up of a preferential option for this shortcut is of tremendous importance, because this is what would lead to the idea of mindfulness as a kind of standalone process that people like Google or what have you could use to work better, for stress reduction, to lose weight, whatever, to raise your kids, anything that mindfulness is now applied to. The fact that it can stand alone kind of emerges out of this sort of popularization of this kind of shortcut understanding of jumping right into insight. Well, Ledi promoted this style of practice, what had been a secondary and actually little-known option for everybody. He had meditators turn almost immediately to insight by putting the focus of observation on the elements, earth, wind, fire, and water, and the focus on those elements within the body. And these elements can be observed as the constituents of the smallest particles of matter. There are, namely, those kalapas, which are first formulated in Abhidhamma commentarial literature. Now, such kalapas arise and pass away very quickly, just like everything else. Billions are going by every time I snap my fingers. So to observe them is to observe the fundamental Buddhist lesson of impermanence. The heritage of this approach in terms of its effects on Buddhism would be, as I note, at the end of the birth of insight, the centralization of insight practice and learning within the modern Buddhist sasana. As this quote from one of Burmese most well-known monks shows, obviously both of those monks, well, the monk on the right is probably better known. He's of course not Burmese. That's the Dalai Lama, but the Theravāda kind of makes clear what he says here, and the fact that Vipassana and Abhidhamma have this intimate relationship. This fact of this intimate relationship, let's say, you can see materially in the statue of the Buddha that I began the talk with. Let me show you a picture again. Now at the Bodhidharma Stupa in Yangon, an image which has the very words, I don't know if you can see it in the intro picture that I blew up the hands here. Ati and Tati, learning and mindfulness. Sort of the idea is the Buddha is presenting the two fundamental aspects of Buddhism to you on his very palms. And the lesson is you got to learn them and then you practice mindfulness. The idea that they go together. Learning fundamentally and Abhidhamma. Well, in a Great Awakening, I'm tracing the genealogy of insight practice, first formulated by Ledi. As his successors, some in direct lineal connection to him, others outside of it, take up and continue to shape insight, both in Burma and eventually elsewhere, including in the United States. Ledi died in 1923, but influential teachers such as Uba Khin, S.N. Goenka, and Mahasi Sayadaw, here's pictures of them, and many others, of course, too, would spread the teachings beyond the borders of Burma. In the movement from Burmese teachers to influential Americans, such as Jack Kornfield and Joseph Goldstein and Sharon Salzberg, were the three figures on the kind of right-hand side of that picture in front. That's Mahasi Sayadaw behind them. Well, in the movement from, say, Mahasi to these figures, what we see is a path-dependent process made possible by an Abhidhammic formulation that continues to develop to the point now that there's many times a seeming exclusion of any doctrine at all, especially in the U.S., so I would argue actually in many other places as well. The genealogy is tremendously complex, in fact. Here's just a simple, rather hard to follow lineal chart I just jotted down. It's definitely highly simplified, in fact. But even as simplified as this is, this slide suggests the fact that between Pa'ot's career, who we're about to turn to, and Ledi's is a span in which insight meditation has certainly undergone profound transformations. Thus, from Ledi's promise of awakening in this very life on the basis of the mastery of this Abhidhamma poem, we get to a mindful revolution like the Time magazine cover suggests. And that revolution is typically seen as characterized by an internal state free of anything, a state of what's often called bare attention. That's explained and justified in a secular psychotherapeutic mode. And this can be seen in the secular and widely applied practice, for instance, of mindfulness-based stress reduction formulated by John Kabat-Zinn. So what I'm doing here is I'm drawing a through line of the human use of a philosophical system to create profound social change. What Ledi did, joining the Abhidhamma practice, made, perhaps somewhat ironically, bare mindfulness, a kind of mindfulness free of any doctrine, possible. But it also made possible a recent approach that is reconfiguring meditative practice once again, and that's that of the Pa'ot Sayadaw, so let's turn to him. He's still very active in Burma and elsewhere, in Asia, as well as in the U.S., in fact. His notoriety and appeal in the U.S. are emerging principally out of the institutional and interpersonal nexus of the Insight Meditation Society. There's a picture of it, usually just called IMS. That's the institution founded by these folks, Joseph Goldstein, Jack Kornfield, and Sharon Salzberg.
What when was that picture taken, do you know?
This one here?
No, with Salzberg.
Oh, yeah, well, clearly the 70s. Well, early 80s perhaps. Mahasi was last there, if I remember correctly, in no, late 70s, I believe. But I'm not precisely sure. Yeah, it's a great picture. And I might mention that's Jacqueline Schwartz on the left, who's also a very influential founder of the organization, but I don't think in any way intentionally, but because she left the sort of scene fairly early on, she tends to be sort of not noted as prominently because she no longer teaches with the organization. But she was also actually a very important figure at this time, as were some other folks as well. Okay. Back to the operating list. Okay, but back to Pa Oseda. His Abhidhamma-infused teachings are reshaping practice, and it's inframing the worldview, let's say, in ways that show the divergent possibilities of the effects of practice. He's in the same landscape of insight meditation with these Western figures. Clearly, he's brought to their institution, he works with them, what have you. But he's not of it in the same way. That seems quite clear. Now, I use this term landscape in order to evoke Arjuna Puttarai's idea of the scape as indicating a kind of global exchange of teaching and practices, in this instance of Buddhism. In such a scape, what I want to call a Dharma scape, people do not necessarily meet as equal agents on a level playing field, yet they do meet in relationships, sometimes marked by the friction of differing agendas and worldviews, but nonetheless within a shared sense of a kind of larger arena, or let's say Dharma scape. This approach, the reason I like this, the point of that kind of theoretical formulation, is that it brings to our attention the relationships that are going on here that help us move beyond what I think is too often a default level of analysis of the nation state, and to see in a more fully interregional way, and thus move beyond a disciplinary balkanization that has tended to see developments in Buddhist practice and thought in America, or in Burma for that matter, or elsewhere, as certainly not closed off from outside influence, but perhaps buffered from it by categorizations in terms of things like the nation state or some reified idea of culture or whatnot, trying to instead put the focus on an idea of relationship to create change across borders. Pa Oseda, let's turn to him specifically, was born in 1934 in Lower Burma in a village called Ledi, about 100 miles from Yangon. Like Ledi, he first ordained at 10 years old. In a way also similar to Ledi, he's as much a scholar as a meditator. In fact, it's quite evident in highly learned Abhidhammic meditation texts. He first trained actually under Mahasi, sitting back there. So he first trained under Mahasi and also under U Pandita, the guy who wrote In This Very Life. I'll get to that in a second. So at least at first, he actually trained in the same system and indeed with the exact same teachers as Goldstein, Salzburg, and Bloomfield. In 1981, he took over the Pao Forest Monastery in southern Burma, Mon State. He's written numerous works. In 1999, the Burmese government named him an Agamahakamatan which means foremost great teacher of meditation. It's a very prestigious title. And Pao has lectured and led retreats outside of Burma since 1997, so quite a while now, including in the United States, which he first visited in 2002. He first taught at IMS in 2006, another time in 2011. He actually has his own monastery in California and of course elsewhere. Anyway, so it's very clear by that teaching, by the relationship with teachers, that there's a direct link to the IMS and its strain of development that I mentioned earlier that puts some prominence in this bare insight kind of approach. Pao's approach to meditation, however, is distinctive for its emphasis on cultivating the jhanas. So if you recall, those are the deep states of concentrated absorption entered prior to beginning insight practice. The very ones Ledi said you could skip, there's no shortcut for Pao. You decidedly do not skip those states. But it's not just that he actually encourages, that is to say Pao, that he encourages a focus on concentration practice. That's distinctive, but Pao is especially noteworthy for presenting and encouraging practice of the entirety of the Visuddhimagga system. So I mentioned earlier that Visuddhimagga is this 5th century work that encapsulates authoritatively the Theravāda view of practice in relation to doctrinal teaching. And it works within what's called in Pali an Abhidhamma Pariyaya, or an Abhidhamma perspective. It mentions dry insight practice, but it clearly favors cultivating the jhanas first, detailing 40 different objects that may be used by the meditator to develop his or her concentration. However, in Pao's approach, ideally the practitioner not only ought to cultivate the jhanas, but ought to attain them using the whole range of objects listed in the Visuddhimagga for concentration, one after the other. So from the object of the breath, to the 32 parts of the body, to the contemplation of the skeleton, to the kasina devices, all these kind of technical kind of things, kasina devices and whatnot, that you use to concentrate. You do them all, and only then you proceed to the other purification of insight. Now, a chart, rather daunting looking as well, created by his 2 American students, Tino Rasmussen and Stephen Snyder, 2 of his numerous American students, This actually shows the possibilities for the progression of practice in this complex system. Most folks begin, you can see it down here, with Anapana, what it says, start here, in most cases. Most people begin with breath meditation, but you can see you can also actually, it says start here in most cases, or here in fewer cases, you can begin with the 4 elements as well. Those are actually rather like Ledi. Well, the emphasis on the elements, it has some commonality with Ledi, since he too would emphasize those. And in fact, all practitioners in the Palo system will end up analyzing the 4 elements in terms of the Kalapas in order to move properly into actual insight practice, but only after the heroic progression through all the rest of it. So this is all, if you start here and you move through here and you go down here, here, up here, through here, all the way to here, and this is where their book ends. And it's only actually here that insight meditation begins, which they don't even get to this. Everything else is just concentration. Now, Pa'o will readily admit that few are able to make it through this whole system, though some reportedly have. In fact, these Westerners, you see Rose, this is Tina Snyder, and so Rasmussen and Snyder here, Shyla Catherine over on the far right. They all apparently have made it through the system. The appeal of this practice among a self-selected but growing cadre, who Snyder and Rasmussen like him to be involved in what they call Jedi warrior mind training. This signals the possibility of a new sort of cosmological view, transmitted and reinforced in the practice among some modern meditators. And I'd like to speak to this matter of one's cosmological view in the final part of this talk by discussing the final stage of the system, that of insight meditation for Pa'o. Now, you may have noticed, it's circled in red on this version of the chart there down at the bottom, this evocatively named crystal body. You develop such a body, you actually develop in your deep concentration, your body becomes crystalline and clear and kind of translucent and shining with light and all these very interesting things. And you develop such a body through concentration and you use it to break yourself down into a subatomic calopic structure. By doing that, breaking yourself down by kind of observing your crystal body and its kind of disintegration, you thus discern the ultimate kind of ephemerality of materials, of materiality. It's anicca or impermanent nature. Pa'o explains that in doing so, and a meditator, by kind of discerning ultimate materiality, apprehends directly the 28 forms of material reality as defined in the Abhidhamma text. And in fact, the list is given straight up in his meditation text. This is from his book, Knowing and Seeing. After you've seen these 28, one turns to mentality, nama, having finished with rupa. And this chart, for instance, gives a blow-by-blow account of the epistemological process for perception by sight. This is a chart of the 5-door consciousness. 5-door cognitive processes is put here. This is not just background information for your kind of information as you meditate. This chart shows you precisely what you should, once you've developed your mind sufficiently, actually perceive. So you should see each jhavana or impulsion, the registration, all those sort of steps in the epistemological apperceptive process. In other words, you should see the Abhidhamma taxonomy as it's laid out in the text. By doing so, you observe the fabricated nature of mentality, having already explored materiality's conditioning. You then turn to the observation of opinion origination, and there's really no surprise in that regard. I mean, that's a fundamental aspect of reality in all these systems. But the unusual part is that in this process, you are required to observe dependent origination's workings, not just in one's current life, not just actually in your past lives, but also in all of your future lives up to the existence in which you attain awakening. So in this current life, if you're successful in the Palo meditative system, you'll also get to see all of your future lives up to the time you become an arhat or awakening. Now let's talk about the seeing of future lives. It's actually a somewhat touchy subject. Palo's books were in fact long suppressed by the Burmese government, not available, and they're not always actually easy to find. And it's widely believed the principal reason for this was the claim to see future lives. More precisely, to see one's future lives as part of insight practice. A number of prominent monks in Myanmar argued that such unreal objects as future lives, because they haven't happened yet, right? So they're not really real, couldn't actually be classified as part of insight practice, because insight practice can only deal with what's actually real, what you actually can observe as a reality. And thus, to observe future lives is not within the purview of insight meditation, since insight meditation can only be about what's real, and therefore the argument goes Paul's books are fundamentally flawed in that regard, and to that degree, I guess, dangerous to the Dhamma. Paul disagreed. Of course, he stuck to his guns about this sort of meditative method, and his view that one should observe all future lives has certainly gained enough acceptance now to make it in print. His student Shyla Catherine, in her book, so the American Shyla Catherine, her book Wisdom Wide and Deep, gives very explicit instructions, in fact, on how to observe your future lives. Now, this is a long quote. I'm not going to read this, but you can see just by scanning it, I did put one part in bold there I'll talk about. She recommends first you go forward. You're sitting there in meditation. First you actually jump forward into the future a couple minutes. Then you jump forward an hour. Then you go up. You make your way up to the moment of your death, and you see how you die in this current life. Then you move on to your next life, and so on and so forth until you get to the end of your karmic stream and see how you attain awakening and then parinnibbana, final awakening in your final death. Now notice that, and this is why that part's in bold. In another sign of the technical Abhidhammic nature of this activity, Catherine reminds the reader that one should notice that it requires 31 to 35 mental factors or chaitasikas to achieve either a human or celestial rebirth. It's very grounded in this sort of technical understanding of the Abhidhamma. This cosmological orientation, so clearly beyond, if not entirely outside of the sort of this worldly psychological orientation of someone like, say, John Kabat-Zinn, this complicates our understanding, I would argue, of the trajectories of Buddhism's development. It calls our attention back to one of the larger thematic concerns of my current book and this talk. How forms of Buddhist practice take on all these, let's say, multiple iterations, changing at times in a way that make them appear to go backwards as much as forward in terms of processes of modernization. Because processes of modernization are often assumed to involve an increasingly disenchanted rationalism that favors so-called iron cage. If not as the only eventuality, at least as the only possibility that the logic of rationalization is followed completely faithfully, let's say. And no doubt, actually a kind of disenchanted, rationalized, secular meditation is a possibility. And my current project will argue that the mindful revolution depends upon and often reinforces a sort of mechanization of the mind that reads the world in materialist terms. Certainly that can be a product of a kind of cognitive scientific approach to meditation, but that's not the only possibility for the modernist uses of Buddhist practice. As I emphasized for Ledi in the case of colonial Burmese modernist developments in The Birth of Insight, what counts as a form of modernity can vary greatly. What's interesting here is to see this fact now evident in forms of Buddhism that operate on a global stage, crossing borders and certainly having taken root in America, as someone like Shyla Catherine shows. Forms of Buddhism on a global level quite simply are not following a single or simple process of modernization or rationalization. In fact, they are distinctive cultural formulations that can become, at least from the perspective we have now, more traditional in certain ways. This is not to say that Pa'o practitioners are actually becoming more traditional. The label traditional is not a neutral one, but a disciplinary move to dismiss what is seen as outmoded often. In fact, Pa'o cosmological elements do not signal a retreat from modernity, but the development of a new variety of Buddhist modernity, let's say a new variety of modern Buddhism. It's in light of this situation that we can touch upon here at the end the issue about the changing nature of the secular religious divide that's the larger interest in my current research. The secular is anything but a simple term, of course, often simply taken to mean the absence of religion. Yet it would be better to consider a sort of principled distance from, I'm quoting Charles Taylor here, or neutrality towards religion. As Charles Taylor has argued, the secular is not a mere subtraction story. It contains its own goods, synthetic qualities, certain kinds of political arrangements, a kind of humanist flourishing, maybe even a kind of mindful revolution. Striving for such goods reminds us, within the secular context, that keeping a position of purported distance or neutrality vis-a-vis religion, or let's say the spiritual, requires constant negotiation within specific context about what counts and what doesn't, say religious or secular or what have you. Indeed, following Randall Collins, we can say that, quote, secularization is not a zeitgeist, but a process of conflict. Now, discerning your future lives up to nirvana, like Catherine recommends, could hardly be more Buddhist. It has taken hold in the U.S., for instance, in a context that mixes it in a complex fashion with a certain permutation of the secular viewpoint, one expressed in the psychotherapeutic vision of many modern American teachers. Where and when, in a specific order of events, a development occurs matters very much to its formation and influence. So it's not just what the thing is, but where it happens to take place. So it is with Pao meditation. Its point of origination within the secular mindfulness milieu, that is to say, the sort of IMS scene, matters very much to its nature and effects in the U.S., and that determines its oblique relationship to the secular. Such meditation provides many with a powerful sense of meaning, and even, we might say, an enchanted life. And surely sitting for hours and watching your future lives kind of roll along to the end of all suffering as an arhat provides a kind of sense of enchantment. This kind of enchanted experience is typically seen as outside of the secular. It's what is lost in secularization, it's often argued. And indeed, this kind of enchanted experience depends on apparently traditional, highly complex, and technical Abhidhamma teaching. Yet it is often presented in at least quasi-secular contexts with scientific, psychological, and neurological justifications. For example, return to Shadow Catherine, she calls her work a pragmatic application of Buddhist psychology at the beginning, and pitches it to those interested in practice but with no belief in Buddhist cosmological concepts. But how does that work if you're supposed to see your future lives at the moment of awakening? There's a kind of schizophrenic flavor to that, and it indicates the complicated, sometimes contradictory and provisional relationships between the religious and the secular. Now this is true in the US, but it's also true in fascinating ways in Burma, but there's a tension present there too. Now, I've gone and interviewed leading psychiatrists, meditation teachers, what have you, to get their take on the uses of practice. And the conflict is broadly evident, as many appeal to a methodologically, particularly scientific-minded folks like psychiatrists, appeal to a methodologically materialist scientific justification for practice that they understand to be a kind of universal claim applicable to everyone, but who also wish to hold fast to a distinctive Buddhist identity that intends to entail kind of cosmological conceptions that go beyond what can is usually understood universally applicable in the secular context. Well, the developments from the Ledi to Pao suggest that, yes, some secularizing meditators could end up in a kind of post-Buddhist frame of mind, or already are, strictly focused on practice, shorn of all cosmological commitments. That's clearly already present. Indeed, it's happening, and it continues. People continue to be drawn to that kind of notion of meditation as purely secular. But it's not the only possibility for the reconfiguration of the relations of Buddhism and secularism. And this is all the more the case when one considers other influences, preeminently the neurophysicalist term, the related mindful revolution on secular terms, which are also critical components of my book project, for they too are shaping global sensibilities, although I don't have the opportunity or the time to discuss those today. So it's certainly a complex landscape I'm exploring, and one with many trajectories. But I hope you're convinced that the Abhidhamma has been an important part of it, one that different actors have used to shape different forms of Buddhist modernism that my current project will continue to explore. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for giving us a very clear description of even 100-year history of the Buddha, which has made me comment this role. So, before looking to forward this lecture, I'd like to summarize in Japanese for Japanese audience in a few minutes.
Please, yes.
非常に分かりやすい発表でしたので、理解していただいたと思いますけれども、簡単に日本語で、ポイントを、まとめておきます。まず今日の話は前半と後半に分かれておりまして、前半で、レリーシャル、そして後半で、パウというそれぞれ代表的な修行者、僧侶を取り上げられました。いずれもビルマという世界において、伝統的なメディテーション、その瞑想修行と、それと、哲学的な阿弥陀羅の議論というですね、この、2つを共に一般の人々に開き出したかつてなかった出来事が起きてきた、それを起こしてきた2人だということであります。に注目をしたのは、阿弥陀羅という 複雑な哲学理論が、仏教のですね、その大衆化、ポピュラリゼーションに、大きな影響を与えるという、まるでそのちょっと私たちが想像をしてなかった出来事が起きているということで、あります。そしてその、哲学的な言語を一般に開いていくということをしたこの2人がそれぞれその異なったやり方をしていると特徴を持っているということですね。で前者、においてレディの方はそのヴィパッサナという修行に、重心を置いて、そしてこのアビダルマのその修行体系というのを分かりやすく開いてきた。それに対して、そのパウクはその他の方にもしっかりと重心を置いて、その修行体系を一般に開き出していると。でこれが現在その影響を持って今続いているところでありますけれども、それぞれにその特徴があって、いずれもビズティマッカというですね、5世紀のテキストに基づいているということであります。で個々にはそれぞれ興味深い、例えばパウクの場合は縁起の観察がですね、過去の自分の経験ではなく、あるいは現在起こっていることではなく、未来に起こることまでも意識の中取り入れて、観察に取り入れているということが述べられている、そういう特徴的なものがあると。でこれらがですね、その今日重要なセキュラリゼーションというテーマでありますけど、その世俗化というのが、極めて重要な意味を持っているプロセスを持っているとですね、異なった言語体系を抱えた者同士がお互いにエンカウンターであって、そして議論をして、そしてこの新しい知恵をですね、作り上げていく、そういう事態が今起きていると、そのような非常に広い、視野からのメディテーションとそのアビダルマの題材にしながらですね、今のその国民国家であるとか、そういう概念自体の問題の取り返しをされているというものでありますから、問題の視野が非常に広いこのように認められると思います。で、どんな質問でも構いませんが、はい、この内容に関わる質問以外はお認めいたしません。
はい。Can you spell Theravāda and Abhidhamma in Chinese character?
I'd like to continue this explanation.
Save energy and time.
Please be quiet until he finishes talking.
Yes, any question or comments will be welcomed, so long as they are concerned with the content of this lecture. So otherwise, if not, I will intervene and let us stop by virtue of Chairperson's prerogative. So I think there are many specialists here in dharmic thought and Pali Buddhism and meditation practice. From any kind of perspective, I think the question is the comments as well.
Thank you very much for your wonderful talk and congratulations on the Prize. Let me ask you 3 questions. First question is on Pao meditation method. You mentioned that some crystal body has an important role in his system. What is the body equivalent to crystal body in this manner? I've never seen this.
I don't, well now I can't recall the Burmese, but I do not believe that he takes that term. It's his own formulation.
Okay.
So it's not, I'll double check again in Knowing and Seeing. That's where I drew that from. He talks about it in other works as well, if I'm not mistaken. but so far as I'm aware, it's not something he draws from a kind of from like sort of Surimaga or a kind of Pali formulation. It's a sort of Burmese, a kind of Burmese. So in fact, actually, to be fair, in fact, crystal body is not exactly the term he uses. He says like body like ice, body like glass, and really it's Tina's, but Snyder and Rasmussen, there they are, the folks at the bottom there, who actually, it's coming back to me now, that's right, who actually use the term crystal body. So in Burmese, it's sort of his colloquial description of what happens as you develop your concentrated parameters, and they apply that term.
This is just idea, but at the beginning of the Panya-Bhavana chapters, that concept of Ovasa appears. Is that the equivalent to the crystal body? Ovasa, light.
Yeah.
Do you think
Well,
that's,
light is associated with the crystal body, and I mean
maybe that's the reason.
So I suspect, well, they're related, but like in the sense that they use crystal instead of light or some other term. There seems to be another step. There seems to be an intervening step before this kind of light emerges, because the light seems to come out of the creation of the body itself, this kind of ice-like, glass-like crystal body. So there is some sort of connection, but it doesn't strike me that it's formulated in quite the clear way it is in Pao, in the same way in the Sugima. So you may, I refer to you if it seems like there is some stronger connection. And was that the second? Is there a...
Yeah, second question is on Ledi Sayadaw. You said that the reason why he sees the importance of Abhidhamma is because he, when Buddhism disappeared, the Patana disappeared first.
Right.
Yeah, this prediction appears repeatedly in the commentaries and sub-commentaries and Sagasang, as you know.
Yes.
But probably this passage originally comes from old sources which Buddha was adapted.
Right.
That is the reason why this prediction lacks the mentions to Kuttara Nikaya. I think it's an interesting point, but does Ledi Sayadaw say something about that? If he based on, or does he mention to any specific text when he explains this prediction?
No, not so far. That's why I was like, well, it's interesting. He sort of takes this common knowledge, the 5,000 years and whatnot, that really is first formulated in Monorato Purani and these kind of texts, but doesn't dwell on details. He seems to draw on a kind of fund of common Burmese. He assumes a kind of common Burmese knowledge about the length of time, and doesn't really. Well, he wrote so much. There may be a place that I'm unaware of where he does that I don't know about it, where he does spend more time talking about it. But it's generally in the text I'm dealing with. It's assumed. He will make reference to 5,000 years and such things as that, but not any sort of. He won't justify it textually.
Third question is a little bit helpful for your point, but as you know, as recent studies show that the idea, the concept of Theravāda appeared at the beginning of the 20th century. Does Ledi Sayadaw, how does Ledi Sayadaw describe the Buddhism he believes?
Yes, not using the
How
term
does he avoid
Theravāda. He typically, as is so common even now, alongside of Theravāda in the contemporary scene, but he typically uses the term sasana, and he'll say Buddha sasana, or of course Burmese terms like Buddha vada, and various other terms, but you won't find Theravāda as a kind of conception used by him, so that it's true. I use it, I have a kind of cover myself footnote at the beginning of the book where I say, well, Theravāda, it's really quite, it's fairly recent, in fact, in terms of widespread usage, but it's a useful heuristic, let's say. Though there has been some sort of interesting kind of pushback. Patrick Cranky has been doing some work recently, kind of arguing that Theravāda is a more sensible. It's not so anachronistic as we've lately come to kind of take it. But it's true that for Ledi it doesn't really show up as a productive term. Thank you. Thank you.
Japan and giving this great talk. It's very interesting and eye-opening for myself on many aspects. One question, considering all the different techniques from all the teachers, Ledi Seda and Mahasi, and you're referring that they all use the Abhidhamma to a great extent. But considering the differences in their teaching methods, what would be the common ground within the Abhidhamma that they used?
Yeah, it's a great question. So Mahasi Sayadaw, of course, is directly connected to the Mingun Sayadaw, who was rather a contemporary of Ledi Sayadaw, but a junior to him by over 20 years. And so it seems that Mingun was probably, there doesn't seem to be any identifiable direct link between Ledi and Mingun, like an actual kind of disciplinary link or sort of technical link in terms of practice. It's my impression is that Ledi's impact was such that by the time Mingun was on the scene, he certainly would have known Ledi's works. And there seems to be a kind of general reliance, given the kind of widespread interest in Abhidhamma, that is really spearheaded by Ledi, but certainly goes beyond him in terms of interest. It led to a kind of common approach. But technically what seems to be a kind of unifying point for all of them is the focus on sukha vipassana, this kind of idea of skipping the calm and concentrated states to go directly into insight on the basis of kanika samadhi, momentary concentration. This is a sort of common, up until fairly recent times, a sort of common approach that they all use. And then my argument would be that within that dry insight approach, the encouragement to parse reality in terms of these kind of epistemological processes and whatnot, sort of draws its vigor from Abhidhamma, but of course isn't necessary, but certainly isn't something distinctive that you couldn't find more broadly in the Buddhist tradition. So my point is there seems to be a kind of technical option for a dry insight that becomes promoted more widely. It's first promoted by Ledi and probably becomes well known thanks to him. That then allows people within this kind of general Abhidhammic popularization to present epistemological analysis as the kind of basis for meditative practice, but in a variety of ways. So people take it in many different ways, and you couldn't say that everyone sort of draws upon the same approach, except in the broadest sense. Does that make sense to you?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Excuse me. Abhidhamma and Theravāda is a Sanskrit?
Pali. So
Pali.
related to Sanskrit, but
It's very close. What about Tamil?
Tamil.
Tamil, Sanskrit is India.
Right, like Tamil, Tamil.
Tamil.
It's quite different, in fact.
What Sanskrit, very close. What about in Chinese character? Can you spell it?
Oh, no, I certainly
Oh, I
cannot.
see.
I wish I could, but no.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Only curiosity.
yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question. I'm just quite certain that.
Not so philosophical, only curiosity.
Right.
I see, okay, thank you very much.
Sure.
Anyone else?
Yeah, I don't remember.
Thanks very much for your talk. Thanks very much for your talk. It was great. Really enjoyed it. I had a lot of questions, but just one I'll ask in particular. In this very life concept, there's different movements, figures throughout Buddhist history who have focused in on this way of thinking of the Kamakura Japan, for example. You have a number of figures who provide a framework where they draw upon earlier teachings that may have been more obscure and not focused on, and they develop them for a mass audience. I guess I was interested in not just the doctrinal sources, but what do you think it was that led Ledi to seize upon those doctrinal passages and develop this kind of mass or lay orientation set of practices for a mass or lay audience? And I guess a sort of companion question was, you mentioned that even monks were not particularly meditating before he came along. What were they doing, or how would you classify that non-meditation
Right, right. Well, in terms of the question of why, when he sees upon this idea of in this very life, at that moment, separately it's hard to answer about why he personally was sort of inspired to get at it. He doesn't explain it in any sort of personal way. He justifies it on the basis of the possibility that he does see present in the text. Even as Mahasi will make reference to this, in the Satipatthana Sutta at the end, Buddha says, well, if you do this, you'll get awakened. And he keeps lowering and lowering. So a week, a day, and lower and lower. So that was already sort of a possibility. Let's say that generally, the impulse towards the popularization of practice and its possibility seems to have been incited by this sense of threat. So this idea that Buddhism itself was going to disappear, and Ledi himself will make comments like, it's so hard to keep Buddhism going, it's a great burden, these sort of things. We've all got to do our part, whatnot. Seems to have encouraged him to push people towards practice and to sort of celebrate the possibilities if they do it in the right way. But to some degree, you have to add in the factor of just his sort of distinctive genius. He was a very, very, very self-confident man, and he had really, really strong opinions he wasn't afraid to express, and so he was willing to take unusual positions, I should say. All of this, I suppose, combined in the sense to make it seem feasible to him to promote this idea of practice in this very life. So one thing I should say about not meditating, even now, as is true generally, I suppose, in many different Buddhist traditions, but even now, say in Theravāda or in Myanmar in particular, most people don't meditate. The vast majority of monks, I think it's safe to say, don't meditate, depending on how you define meditation. And it does change, of course, but and many people will say do a bit of meditation, or if they're chanting, we count that, because it certainly is a form of self-cultivation. But broadly speaking, classic sitting down and dedicating yourself to meditation, particularly in the pursuit of, say, awakening in this very life and that sort of thing, has been a distinctive minority practice. And what people were doing otherwise, what is considered actually one of the preeminent, of course, roles of the monk, which is preservation of the Dhamma through learning and study. So that was sort of like your main job. And certainly in the culture Ledi grew up in, it's still true now, but it was particularly, let's say, emphasized in Ledi's time as a young man in the royal era. The way to get ahead as a monk, the way to become prestigious and well-known and sort of at the apex of monastic culture was to distinguish yourself, let's say, academically or scholastically. And so that really was the focus of the vast majority of monks who were really seeking to distinguish themselves. Then, of course, there's the broad sort of effort or the sort of broad lifestyle of being a village monk who runs a monastery in the village and whatnot. And then there's all sorts of practices you do. You're teaching the young men and the novice monks, what have you, and all sorts of things. So much of it oriented around learning. And that would really be, I guess, what we would say the main focus was for most folks who weren't meditating, which would be the vast majority of people.
すみません、日本語でいいですか。はい。いいですか。はい。ちょっと下田先生にちょっとこの中で英語はよく聞いてなかったので、もしかしたらお話があったかもしれないです。メディテーションをするときにですね、一体どういうことを頭に浮かべるのかと。で例えば禅宗ですと、曹洞宗と臨済宗では、例えばこっちは曹洞宗は頭からこっち。臨済宗は公安を考える。それとか、真言宗だと、ある形を思い浮かべるんですが、このミャンマーで行われているアブダンマンメディテーションという頭の中に何を考えながら行われているのか、ちょっと興味だけですけど、
His question is concerned with the way of meditation peculiar to Burma. As compared to the Soto Zen in Japan or something like that. So when monks are meditating, what sort of image they are using or they have in mind? So that's kind of
what's the content?
What about the content of meditation?
Right. Well, to some degree, it would depend upon the technique that was, or say the tradition of practice that the meditator was in, would shift your emphasis on one thing or another. The vast majority of meditators will have as their sort of principal object. I don't think you would call this the content exactly, but the focus would be on the breath. So most people begin with anapana, and the breath will sort of occupy your focus. So the breath, of course, is a vehicle. It's understood in the Theravāda tradition that will develop samadhi or concentration, and then can be used. You can kind of ride it along as far as you want in samadhi, and then it can also carry you forward in insight as well. So it can sort of cover both main parts, of the two parts of the Theravāda meditative system. In terms of strictly speaking, in a way, you have a mind that's totally, say, in the concentration aspect of meditation, if it's totally absorbed in its object, then it is in some sense beyond a particular content, particularly if you carry it to the sort of extreme of one point where you enter a state called nirodha samadhi, this kind of state of cessation. In insight, strictly speaking, your object, it could be the breath, but really all sort of experience, however rarefied it might be when you're in this rather deep concentrated state, is the object of the sort of content of your mind that you use to observe fundamentally the selfless, not kind of nature of reality, its impermanence, and then its suffering-filled nature. So if you're somebody dedicated to jhanas, then emerging from the jhanas itself can be the object of your meditation, because it sort of shows you the impermanent nature of all states, the fact that you had to leave it, even though it felt so profound and lasting. Or it might be just, the sort of observation of the everyday world and the way it breaks down. So in other words, it could be many different things categorized along these kind of certain lines that fundamentally teach this lesson of impermanence, selflessness, and suffering. So dukkha, anatta, and anicca.
よろしいでしょうか。はい、はい、ありがとう。
すみません、できればちょっと簡単に訳していただけると。
今の内容ですか。
申し訳ない。私があまり理解できなかったので。
まずメディテーション、サマタとアサナとの内容に触れられていたと思うんですけども、ですね、呼吸、まず呼吸の観察について、私もちゃんと記憶が残ってないのですみません。呼吸の観察について、おっしゃってまして、それで、それが一つ、そして、それはその動きに、自分自身の意識がすべて、吸収されていくんですか、そういうありようであると、いうことを最初におっしゃってまして、それからイメージを浮かべる、その次にいろんなイメージを浮かべるんだけれども、目指すところはそのイメージを超えていくところであると、そのイメージにとどまるんではなくて、そのイメージを超えていくあるというのが、2番目におっしゃったと思います。そして、あとそれがその外のものを観察するの観察で、今度は内側は、最終的にはその無常、例えば無常の観察になっていく物事が生じては滅びていく、その過程を見ていくのがある、内側の観察になると。すいません、非常に不安なサマライズで、誰かちょっと補足をしていただく方いますか。今の足りないところ、足りないところ。質問？よろしい。
ありがとうございます。
他の人は。
先どうぞ。いや、それが。 presentation. Sorry, I have actually sort of a bit of a critical question. So I very much appreciate the information you gave. I don't think I really knew anything about Burmese Buddhism until just now. So the question I had was sort of how you framed your presentation, and perhaps this was made for a different audience than this one. So I can understand maybe that might have come into play, but sort of like what I thought was maybe a little odd was sort of how easily you switch between discussing 19th and 20th century Burmese Buddhism to 21st century Buddhism in America, and then furthermore, how your thesis seemed to be pointing out like how these two were somehow similar or related in a very close way. I mean, I assume you go into more detail in your book, but it just seems to me like on a very fundamental level, obviously there's the connection there, and the fact that Ledi and Paul, I guess, were the teachers of some of these important people, but beyond that, I mean, I guess my real question is more like, I mean, is there nothing that you can say about like how these people, like what they did for Burma, like, or, you know, and the history of thought there? That's sort of my sort of, you know, point, if you could address that. The other thing, if you don't mind, was just sort of a point of clarification more than anything. So you're sort of trying to point, once again, that these two teachers, Paul and Ledi, sort of in the early part of your, in like the third or fourth page here, I'm sorry, the second page, you're sort of pointing at how, you know, these two men use a particularly critical resource to enable insight's ascendancy. That is to say, the development of, you know, the popularization, I guess, of insight, meditation, etc. in today's America. And so that resource is called the Abhidhamma. So that to me, I sort of took that as to be like your main point you were trying to make, that, you know, Oak and Ledi interpreted the Abhidhamma, and that led to mindfulness and the sort of new approach to meditation. But that direct line, I couldn't quite see how this new interpretation of Abhidhamma led to this mindfulness movement. What I could see, you know, was that obviously they had the teachers, and those teachers are, you know, led to the mind, you know, are part of this mindfulness thing. But how does Abhidhamma fit into there was a little bit unclear to me. You know, like what exactly, I mean, you mentioned this like thing where he said like, okay, if you do this one special practice, you can jump very far. But I mean, that stuff is, you know, pretty standard issue, you know, in all of Buddhist, you know, history. It's like, if you just do this, I mean, like the person mentioned before, like with Kamakura Buddhism, there are like, if you just, you know, say 5 syllables, you get Buddhahood, like just in an instant type of thing, or not Buddhahood, you get rebirth in the pure land. But yeah, so yeah, just if you could maybe clarify like what you mean, like how you think about like, or Abhidhamma like really like led to mindfulness is clarify that point. I'd appreciate it. So those two things. Sorry. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I never thought about it quite well, quite in that explicit articulation, but you're probably right that even beyond Buddhism, it's a standard human kind of move, particularly say within religions, a sort of standard issue, as you say, to come up with ways to provide shortcuts or sort of streamline or innovate in ways that build upon the old but suggest some way in which it makes it more accessible in a new way. In other words, to some degree, to argue for a shortcut in practice for liberation is a pretty standard issue, certainly let's say in Buddhism. But what I think we can say here is that the distinctive way it's done in the Burmese situation with Ledi, say particularly with that work called the Padamata Danke, on the basis of the experience he had in Abhidhamma and justified on those terms, broadly speaking as a kind of religious studies category, might have been a fairly kind of standard issue move, but was done in these distinctive ways in the Burmese instance that can't be passed over too quickly, because I think that when he makes that move, it's a distinctive and kind of powerful innovation within his particular tradition. This may in some way dovetail with your first question. You know, what is he doing for the Burmese? If I understood you correctly, you were asking. If I understood you correctly, you suggested, and I can understand why it might appear this way. I'm making such a quick move, seemingly from Burma to the U.S. or to the more global scene, that it might seem that I'm sort of anachronistically just kind of pulling from the past and applying it to the present. But in fact, what I'd like to argue here is that the shortcut move he makes, where he justifies Sukha Vipassana, distinctively his doing that formed a kind of heritage that did transform the whole Burmese scene because of the kind of use of that shortcut method among just a vast multitude of Burmese meditators in the Burmese scene. It does eventually get carried forward to these Westerners, and so to that degree, it's a kind of can be categorized as a move that can be seen in many different instances, in many different examples in different cultures, but is its own distinctive move in the Burmese situation that leads to these distinctive things now. So to get to this point about the connections between now and then, I certainly wouldn't want to argue that there was something that was done in the past, and then basically it just sort of sat there changing things along the way up to now, and nothing else has happened since then. It was I had to do a kind of quick like dance move there to get from one to the other just because of the interest of time. But there continue to certainly be distinctive innovations. The argument in the book, in theoretical terms, is I use the sociological concept of path dependence, this idea that changes in the past certainly don't predetermine or set what's going to happen in the future, but they do certainly narrow the range of possibilities. So there is a deterministic quality to what happens in the future on the basis of what happens, say, now. So in the past, when certain developments in Burmese Buddhism happen, they certainly don't determine what's going to happen later, but they shape the possibilities for what will happen. And my argument is that this distinctive move in the Burmese situation towards this kind of shortcut involving dry insight, it becomes envisioned as a possibility because of the kind of emphasis on kind of Abhidhamma thinking that had developed at the same time, then gets carried forward and makes possible all these kind of changes that happen later, but of course with many other factors that come to shape, say, the scene in the U.S. So I would want to argue that there is something quite important about the distinctive move that's made by Ledi for Burmese that certainly has come to shape the global scene, let's say. And we're actually, Ledi died in 1923, excuse me. So he's not so far off. So his influence, even on a couple of generations, is recent enough that it's that the teacher of this person and the student of that still, I think, actually has a lot of relevance because we don't have to look that far back to see these changes based upon these relationships that end up leading to these various global changes. Well, I'm sorry. This is just sort of. Have I gotten at your question, or is there another answer?
Yeah. No. Of course, that's a good answer. Yeah.
Well, thank you. It's really an interesting question. I appreciate it very much. Much more to say.
So I have two somewhat related questions to you. So, you mentioned a very important concept of modernization, secularization, neutralization, or some kind of thing. And you put into question these terms. It's very stimulating. So, in my impression or understanding, this is concerned with the issue: what sort of discourse composed of what sort of language? And so the issue, the concept of modernization was such kind of very important issue. Could be broken into the issue of the kind of language, very broad sense. So my question is, for example, the transition from or liberation of regionally confined knowledge, written and spoken in Burmese language, to the internationally exchangeable scope of language would be so inevitably concerned with the anglophonic world. So the liberalization of disciplinary organization it seems to be unavoidably implying anglophonization. So in this respect, so Burma, so modern Burma, was amongst modern Burma colonized by the British government, but from the late 19th century, not so long period of colonization, could act quick response to this current world, to open up our new perspective of a sort of exchangeable knowledge world. So I'm sorry, I cannot put on myself, but so my question is, the specificity, a specific role played by the Burmese monks as compared to those in Sri Lanka or in Thailand. And you mentioned the difference in educational system. The Burmese Buddhist tradition held in high esteem the Abhidhamma study, at least from since the 17th century. I think this would be the case, but I'm not sure of the other tradition in Sri Lanka or in Thailand. They didn't have such a system at that time.
Doesn't seem that they, well, you know, I in the book I tell this little vignette that I was told that there's a kind of, it's not really a story, it's really just, as I say, a vignette that the Burmese tell about how a ship had the Tripitaka or the Tripitaka at sea, and the ship broke apart and sank, and the Tripitaka floated, and they say, oh, well, the suttas floated to Sri Lanka, the Vinaya floated to Thailand, and the Abhidhamma floated to the shores of Burma, and hence their specialization. But if you tell that, so far as I'm aware, if you tell that to a Sri Lankan or a Thai monk, they would be like, what? Yeah, that's not, they consider the Abhidhamma very important, and of course they have very fine scholars, and serious monastic scholars studying the Abhidhamma. So there does seem to be something distinctive, though, and this is why I note the 17th century in particular, and some of the pedagogical practices of Burma that do seem to have resulted in a kind of emphasis on the Abhidhamma that you just don't see for whatever reason, and I don't have an excellent explanation for why they chose to put such an emphasis on it. But they do seem to have these pedagogical tools and whatnot that led to a particular influence. For instance, the Burmese developed this system of handbooks called Ayakao that explain the various books of the Abhidhamma in a way that seems to put a distinctive emphasis on their learning. It's different to some degree from the other traditions, perhaps somewhat more standardized and somewhat stronger emphasis. There seems to be some sort of affinity between very early on between a Burmese interest in grammar and their emphasis on Pali, which you can kind of see the connection to in terms of like these kind of technical explications of these sort of systems. But really why, in the end, they seem to have emphasized it so much is hard to say. You know, but it does seem to be the case. That even in fact, if you speak to monks and other traditions, they'll tend to defer, at least to some degree, to the general emphasis on the Abhidhamma in Burma. This may not be getting at a kind of larger question you're asking, but the emphasis on the Abhidhamma does seem to be present in Burma in a way it's not elsewhere. But I don't have one single good answer for why that is. But nonetheless, it seems to be the case.
Just one quick follow-up to Shimona Sensei's question. I'm not sure quite if this is the direction that Shimona Sensei was going in, but I guess, is there a Baudelization of Burmese Buddhist conceptualizations of certain states, meditational or otherwise, that happens in the translation to the Anglo traditions to these disciples?
I see. Like a kind of like distorting simplification or something like that?
Or any other kind of Baudelization along those lines, or anything, any notable or dramatic change that happens in translation, either literally or in concepts being mistransmitted and so on.
Right. Well, you know, I think that might be the first time a person used the term Baudelization. That's a great term. But I don't think in the sense that, like, if I understand that term correctly, there's a sense in which they've kind of denatured it or denuded it or somehow kind of simplified it in the sense that they've somehow impoverished it. I think there are profound changes that end up taking place. For instance, the understanding of a great example is the understanding of mindfulness itself. You know, it tends to be defined in the Western context as bare attention, as a simple kind of awareness of what's going on without an agenda, a kind of non-conceptual or pre-conceptual sort of acknowledgement of experience prior to any kind of content on it. That is distinctly different than the actual, and you know, scholars like Rupert Gethin and a number of other, Bhikkhu Bodhi and a number of other scholars have written about this, that sati in the understanding of the Theravāda tradition is much richer, let's say, or more complex than just the idea of kind of preconceptual knowledge. So that's a good example. The reason, that almost sounds like an impoverishment of the term, right? But the reason I hesitate to say that is because it strikes me that the argument for this kind of agenda-free, choiceless awareness, that's sometimes how sati is defined in the West when it's defined in terms of bare attention, is actually just as complicated in certain ways and just as kind of culturally fruitful, let's say, or culturally productive as the kind of more complicated notion in traditional Theravāda cultures. But it is quite different. It operates in a different way, and the productivity of it comes from a different place, let's say. So to that degree, there is a radical transformation, well, in certain instances, certainly quite radical in understandings of what it is. Sometimes to the extent that it moves the practice quite far from even the conception of it being Buddhist at all, which is an argument you'll hear. You'll hear these teachers say, this isn't really Buddhism, this is just the way things are. Let's observe our experience. So, to some degree, well, another point to add is that if we look particularly at the Western tradition, among certain influential teachers, you will find actually just a kind of straight up lack of concern with any textual knowledge about Buddhism. You can say John Kabat-Zinn, who understands himself to be operating actually as a kind of Dharma teacher in a sense. But it's a remarkable, I'm actually writing a chapter on his approach to meditation right now, and when you look through all his works, I mean, which amount to hundreds and hundreds of pages, if not thousands, there's very few references to Buddhist texts at all. There's an occasional reference to Indra's net, and and a few other, some Zen. He was quite influenced by Zen as well, and some sort of Zen teachings. But there's very, very little. So there's a kind of reformulation in English, and that puts meditation in this whole other secular kind of scientific framework, let's say. And that's a profound change. So those are just a couple of examples. I won't go on forever, but it's a great point. The profound changes are happening. Maybe this even brings it back to the point that the excellent question from the fellow in the back there, I'm forgetting, but that as much as continuities and path-dependent processes continue, dramatic changes take place too because of language, because of culture. And we must always remain aware of the radical or quite profound change that takes place, even though I do most definitely want to emphasize certain continuities that make those profound changes possible.
Thank you very much, Eric. The phenomenon itself is fascinating, and your presentation of it is extremely captivating. And I confess that I have not read your book, but I am highly motivated to do so now. And probably some of the questions that I had, I'm sure some of the questions that entered my mind would be answered if I had read your book. So I just want to make a couple of general comments and perhaps a small question. But one thing that struck me is I do a lot of work with classical Yogacara materials, and Yogacara is always, Yogacara means yoga practice, and supposedly the Yogacaras of 4th, 5th, 6th century India were doing Vipassana meditation on dharmas and so forth, and constructing schema. But we have the texts, we have the Yogacara Bhumi and so forth, but we don't really know what they were practicing. And some people say, how could these guys have been practicing at all if they were reading these texts all the time? But this is an interesting example in this modern situation of a complex canon being taken up as an object for and meditation practices being carried out, and sophisticated analytical meditation being carried out based on that kind of scholastic basis. So it's an interesting example of how that may have, who knows, how that may have been done. And I know that's not it's not a topic of your inquiry, but I was struck to wonder if, what kind of historical examples we can see of this kind of thing in Southeast Asia or elsewhere. Certainly not very much in East Asia. But then again, what the content of the Vipassana meditation, first of all, is mostly shamatha up until a high level, but the content of the Vipassana meditation is not based, for most practitioners, is not based on a mastery of the Abhidhamma, but actually but still the Visuddhimagga is taught to practitioners, and practitioners are studying that.
Oh yes, I mean, it depends on the practitioner, of course, and the tradition to some degree, but absolutely. There's actually a tradition called the Mogo, M-O-G-O-K is how it's usually spelled. I didn't talk about them in this talk, but they actually sit and stare at an extremely complex rendition of the dependent origination with all of its steps and whatnot. Essentially, it fuses analytical study to...
It's a chart?
It's a chart, yeah. They hang they'll hang a poster. They're for sale. So they're for sale all over the place. Sometimes I bring it to a talk and we'll kind of hold it up. So there can be very, very strong kind of connection. But it depends on tradition. Mahasi doesn't really want you to learn anything until you've actually practiced, or they don't want you to be, when you're practicing with them, they don't want you studying alongside that during the actual periods of practice until at least a certain point. So there's varying emphases, but there is certainly an idea that study is an important part for most traditions.
Okay. The other thing that struck me, and especially since it seems to be so unlike the characterization of Theravāda or Southeast Asian meditation, Buddhist practice that I've heard of, was the idea of the short path. And you know, examples were mentioned from East Asian Buddhism, and of course, you know, all traditions have in some way or another, but the way they come about and what their grounding and the way accomplishment is explained is various. For example, in modernistic Japanese versions in Pure Land or the Lotus Sutra tradition, the possibility of suddenly achieving the goal of that tradition is based on usually on empowerment from a Buddha or something like that. Whereas in the Chinese Chan tradition, it all originates in an ontological perspective created in the Platform Sutra, with the verse with the mirror and the stand and so forth. So, and that is a sudden enlightenment that does not really have anything to do with time, has nothing to do with this lifetime, but enlightenment because things are as they are. This path that you described, you introduced us to us. What is the doctrinal or the religious rationale presented for the possibility of the one lifetime achievement?
Well, it's still very much gradual. It's just maybe a little less gradual than before.
Okay.
But it's decidedly still, you know, the idea is that it's the kind of accumulation. There's still, of course, the 4 stages of, you know, Sotapanna and whatnot, and street venturer, and you can be a bunch returner, non-returner, you know, right? The whole, it's quite orthodox in its sort of gradualist conception from this typical Theravāda. But it just adds this one kind of short circuit you can do. But it's still, you must pass through all 7 purifications. Now, I should say I've been writing on this recently as a kind of side project that this shortcut comes in for criticism. Sri Lankan monks in the 50s up to the 70s, there was a pretty significant controversy over the idea of momentary concentration, where it was argued by these monks that this was just wrong-headed. It just was not justified on the basis of the text. And it's true that even in the Visuddhimagga, you know, the use of the term, for instance, Kanika Samadhi it's really quite rare. So anyway, the idea is still very much that it's gradual. It is understood to be justified even in the canonical texts, but it is certainly not passed completely without controversy, even now. Sure.
Thank you.
Sure.
Is there any comments or questions? Okay, please.
日本語ですみません。アメリカではブディズムといったときに、それは社会ではやはり宗教として基本的にありているでしょうか。たくさんの方が最近ブディズム仏教に関心を持っていらっしゃると思うんですと、やはりそれは宗教ですので、なんか宗教が好きなんだねとかっていう感じで受け止められますけれども、アメリカで仏教に興味を持ってメディテーションしたりすることはどういった感じで受け止められているんでしょうか。どちらかというとサイコセラピーとかそちらのなんかやっぱり科学的な感じのアプローチに受け止められるのか、宗教の一つ。
This question is concerned with the, so they asked you which the Buddhism was, is accepted in the United States. So the practitioners in Buddhist meditation are regarded as kind of so people, so religious people. So how can I say? Yeah. So Buddhism is regarded as a religion in the United States.
Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, typically meditation certainly can be undertaken. I think that it's a quite common conception, and the argument is made actually in many by some of the teachers that I've referenced, that you not only do you need not be Buddhist to meditate, but that the meditation itself isn't necessarily Buddhist at all. So if you engage in the meditation system of John Kabat-Zinn, mindfulness-based stress reduction, which of course has this explicit purpose to use mindfulness to reduce your stress, that is typically presented without any reference whatsoever to Buddhism. That was a kind of explicit sort of part of it, was not to make any reference to Buddhism initially, though there's more talk of it now as the years have gone by and it's become quite popular. And in terms of conceptions of Buddhism itself, of course, it depends on how you decide to define the terms religion and whatnot, but you often hear this argument that Buddhism is not a religion, it's a philosophy, or it's a way of life, or it's a technique for well-being. All these sorts of arguments are made in the Essen-Goenka tradition and these kind of secular traditions of kind of therapeutic use of meditation. And it depends, of course, on how you define these terms, but certainly the argument is made that Buddhism itself is not necessarily a religion. And that can be powerfully appealing in say the American context, certainly I think elsewhere as well, because it suggests that in these outsiders some of the kind of issues around religion or whatnot, or identity that are involved in adhering to a particular religious tradition or whatnot. So that has been a kind of classic kind of appeal of Buddhism, the idea that it doesn't fit into the kind of traditional mold of what a religion is. So on the one hand, meditation itself can be divorced from Buddhism. On the other hand, there's also been a kind of long-standing tradition in Western cultures generally, in America certainly, to argue that Buddhism itself is a religion anyway. And so these are kind of powerful rhetorical arguments for its appeal in the American scene. Sure. Thank you very much.
We'll come to the end of this lecture. Thank you. Yeah, so we really appreciate your encouraging questions and comments forward. And as a token of our heartfelt thanks to Professor Braun, let us give a round of